So we're delighted to have Konnie come and speak to us. She is on staff at St. Paul's, and she and her husband Grant have been engaged in ministry there, and she has a special interest in working with millennials and Generation Z. This is an interesting group of people today in our communities of faith, and Konnie has this interest in church planting. So, Konnie, welcome, and thanks for your being with us.
Good morning. So, as he mentioned, I work with a lot of millennials and Generation Z. Generation Z goes basically down to 0 years of age at this point. So every Sunday in our Kids Zone program, I start by saying good morning, and everybody responds, good morning. No, not like that at all. They have to hear us in the sanctuary, and we're at the far end of the church. We're talking maybe 500 meters. Good morning. Good morning. You guys are pretty good. Excellent. So I am Konnie Vissers. I am a pastor at a church just north of here in Leasedale. I am a wife of Grant Vissers and a very proud mother. I have a 13-month-old daughter who's at home right now. She's running all over the place, getting into all sorts of trouble. I very much understood the illustration earlier about 2-year-olds. She's hit that phase early, I guess, but yes. So I don't tell very many people this, so please keep it a secret. I'm an American. I am a permanent resident of Canada now, but I actually have lived in 6 different states. I was born in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. Lived in Washington, Colorado, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, which is where I met my husband, and 3 different countries, so Canada, the United States, and Guatemala. So my perspective on things is a little bit varied from just the general Canadian context, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. As a millennial myself, I have 30 years of experience in being a millennial, and so I'm going to talk about what it looks like to connect with millennials and Generation Z in our churches. And what I was actually invited to speak about was the idea of a church plant in Oak Ridges. But I thought what might be more helpful for some of you is connecting both the principles of church planting and some concepts you could actually use in existing congregations as well. So I want to open with a story. My husband Grant and I, after being married for, I think, 9 months at that time, decided it was a good idea to take a road trip. And we were fairly poor our first year of marriage, as many people are, and we wanted to visit my parents and siblings on the west coast of the United States, but we also had a wedding to go to in New Jersey. And so we took 3 weeks off of work and drove from just north of Toronto all the way out to Seattle, Washington. So that's 3,000 miles, about 5,000 kilometers. Then down the Oregon coast. We got food poisoning, by the way, along the way. I will never take a road trip like this again. And then we drove across to visit some friends in Kentucky, then all the way to New Jersey for this wedding and back in 3 weeks. It was a nightmare, to say the least. The wedding was beautiful. But while we were out west, I wanted Grant to see where I grew up, or where I lived for the first 10 years of my life. So we went to this little town called Wilsonville, just outside of Portland, and I thought it would be really cool to go see the church that my parents were married in. Now, they didn't grow up in the church themselves, they weren't members of a church, but they did get married in a church, as you did in the day. And so we went to this church, Wilsonville United Methodist Church. But it wasn't a church, it was a bar. By the time we got out there in 2014, 2015, the church was a bar. And I've gotten a lot of responses when I tell that story, everything from sheer shock to laughter. But I think the point is this: when the church ceases to be the church, the world takes over. When the church ceases to be the church, the world takes over, whether we like it or not. Now, just a little sidebar here, it's actually my favorite restaurant in the Portland area. They go into old buildings and refurbish them and then have a bar and restaurant. So it could have been worse, but needless to say, the church there ceased to be the church, and the world took over. I think we're mostly aware that mainline churches are in decline today. There's a number of reasons for this. There's been a rapid secularization in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe. Canada is somewhere in between the US and Europe on this. Another reason for church decline is hypocritical hurts, is what I like to call them. That's people have been burned by the church. They've been burned by Christians. I've never heard anybody say that they've been burned by Jesus. They get burned by Christians. And so they leave the church, they leave the faith altogether because of people, unfortunately. Another thing I hear very frequently from millennials especially is, I'm spiritual, I'm just not religious. How many of you have heard that phrase before? I'm spiritual but not religious. It means I believe in something. There must be something out there, some reason for being. But I don't like institutions. That's a very popular thing among my generation. Something I want to underscore here is that millennials aren't a generation of people who've grown up in the church. In fact, we didn't grow up and then leave the church. Our parents didn't grow up and leave the church. It was our grandparents' generation at this point who left the church. So that would be my story personally. My grandparents left the church 2 generations ago. So my parents didn't grow up in the church. Then I entered the church when I was 14 years old because of an evangelical friend of mine. So it's a very different story from what we're hearing from baby boomers or Generation X even. How many of you have heard any of the following phrases? I believe in Jesus. I like Jesus. It just seems like the church is full of hypocrites. Have any of you heard that? It's unfortunately a very common thing we hear. How about this one? I don't go to church because I wouldn't be accepted there. A few of you heard that one? How about this? I think this one's really prevalent today. Why would I add yet another activity to my already busy life? Yeah. These are all reasons that people are not going to church. So what I want to take a look at is, what does it mean to be the church? First, I like the via negativa approach to this. Tom Rainer, he's an author, he wrote a book called Autopsy of a Deceased Church, kind of a graphic title, and the subtitle is 12 Ways to Keep Your Church Alive. But what he looks at are the reasons that the church ceased to be the church in different places. One is that the past is the hero. The past is the hero. The second one is that the budget moved inward. So instead of funding outreach or using the money to help others, the budget moved inward to maintenance, to help people within the church, not to reach people out of the church. The preference-driven church. This one's really important and all too common. The preference-driven church is one where the pastor ends up needing to be a people pleaser to appease the congregants, rather than equipping the congregants to go out into the world and help witness to the gospel of Jesus. Another one he says is the Great Commission becomes the Great Omission. That one hits really close to home for me. The Great Commission becomes the Great Omission. We cease to be the church when we stop proclaiming, as David was speaking about this morning, the kingdom of God. The next one is the church rarely prays together. Tom Rainer defines this as an incredibly critical role in any congregation. Sure, every church prays. We say the prayer of confession, we pray the prayer of thanksgiving, the pastoral prayer on Sundays. But when the church gathers and prays in a dynamic and powerful way, change happens. The final one is the church obsesses over the facilities. And I want to talk about this one a little bit more later. But when a church obsesses over facilities, it means mentally the church has become the building, not the people. What Jesus says about the church is this. In Matthew 16, he's talking to Peter and he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Just think about that church for a moment. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. That seems like a spirit-moving, powerful place that Jesus speaks of. The thing I think that we miss today a lot of the time is that church, it's not a building. We know that much. But it's a movement with a mission. It's not any movement with any mission. It's a particular movement with a particular mission. The mission being the proclaiming of the kingdom of God. But the movement is a really important aspect as well. See, church in that passage is defined as ekklesia. Many of you have heard this term before. It's the Greek word for church, but it was never meant as a building. Ekklesia was a gathering, an assembly. One of the official definitions is a gathering of people assembled tumultuously, or if by chance. Assembled tumultuously. That just sounds chaotic to me. But a church is when the people come together. It doesn't necessarily mean decently and in good order. I know I could get in trouble for saying that. But it's when the people gather together. But the church is this. The church must keep the main thing the main thing. Today's verse, the whole concept behind the God's kingdom planning day is, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." It's from Matthew 6. And I think if we start anywhere, it has to be with this passage, seeking God first. You see, I think that the only unique value proposition we have as Christians is Jesus. If we try to be attractional, we're going to miss out on a lot of people because we're not going to be as attractive as the movies or as the radio or as television programming. The only unique value proposition we have is Jesus. That's what we can offer people. Just to get in a little bit on some facts and some understanding about what millennials are and are not. I think it's probably the most misunderstood generation alive today in a lot of ways. So traditionalists are those who are over 72 right now. Baby boomers are now between 54 and 72. Generation X would be between 38 and 53. Millennials, who I hear a lot of times people refer to them as kids, are between 22 and 37. So millennials have kids of their own, many of them do. Generation Z is the newest generation, and that is 21 and under. And there are some very different characteristics of Generation Z versus millennials. Probably the first and foremost being that Generation Z knows nothing but technology. My daughter, who's 13 months old, has figured out how to turn on our TV, and we don't even watch TV when she's in the room. I don't know how this happened, but she actually tried to order a movie the other day. We got to her in time, but that's very different from millennials. Millennials were those who were alive when the dawning of the World Wide Web happened. So we grew up with technology, but we have been set at pace with it. We don't understand it intuitively like the next generation. I like this passage. Rachel Held Evans is a really popular author. who writes on millennials in the church. She herself is a Christian who has left the church off and on. She wrote a very famous book, a New York Times bestseller, about living a year of biblical womanhood. An interesting read. But she says this about millennials. What millennials really want from the church is not a change in style, but a change in substance. We're not leaving the church because we don't find the cool factor there. We're leaving the church because we don't find Jesus there. Some surprising stats about millennials. The Barna Group, I would write this down if you are taking notes, B-A-R-N-A, Barna Group. They specialize in research on different generations and how they can be reached with the gospel. And so they've run a whole lot of research. Hundreds of thousands of people have been studied in their studies on millennials and what the ideal church would look like for millennials. So I was actually surprised by some of these stats myself. So they gave them 2 words, all of the participants in the study, and said, which of these words describes your ideal church? The first one was community versus privacy. 78% of millennials said community. That one wasn't surprising. The next one was sanctuary versus auditorium. 77% of millennials said sanctuary represented their ideal church. The next one was classic over trendy. 67% of millennials said classic represented their ideal church. Quiet over loud. Again, 67% said quiet. These might be some surprising stats. Casual over dignified. This one less surprising. 64% said casual. And the final one was modern over traditional. 60% said modern. So, all you need is a community-oriented church that meets in a sanctuary, that it has classic decor, but is quiet, casual, and modern. Millennials are full of surprises. I don't know what to tell you there. I think the important thing is to keep the main thing, the main thing. And as I've said before, Jesus is our only unique value proposition. You see, if we think just about the music, so many wars have been fought in churches in the last few decades over music, contemporary versus traditional. Millennials actually want authenticity more than they want popular music. The music in any of our churches cannot compete with what's on the radio. So if we're just trying to attract the best musicians or the top music of the day, it's not going to compete. Authenticity is going to win out. Children's programming. All of these things, by the way, are very important and need to be happening in your churches, but they're not the main thing. Children's programming should be happening, but it should be authentic. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in our congregational context in a little bit. Small groups, same thing. They need to be happening. Matthew presented some awesome findings on small groups and how they've impacted the church in Barrie. Our congregation has about 150 people involved in small groups right now. Excellent ministry, absolutely crucial, but it's not the main thing. Sermons, also, they need to be good, they need to be Bible-based, but they're not the main thing. This final one, seeker-friendly. We need to be seeker-friendly, but it's not the main thing. Jesus is our only unique value proposition. So then I went and I looked at some more studies on millennials and actually why millennials stayed in church, if in fact they ever entered the church. So Barna studied millennials who had been in church for a considerable amount of time and decided that they wanted it to be part of their lifestyle. And there are 5 reasons that millennials stay in church that they just deduced from and these being the 5 main reasons. Embrace relationships with a variety of age groups. This was really important to millennials, that the congregation wasn't just made up of millennials. This is a very common misconception. Millennials wanted intergenerational relationships, both with older and with younger, being emphasized by churches. The second principle was that churches that millennials liked taught cultural discernment. So that was not oversimplifying Scripture, but using Scripture and helping apply it to what that means to life today. The third one is that these churches made reverse mentoring a priority. How many of you have heard of reverse mentoring? Very few. Maybe just one. Reverse mentoring is taking a younger person and an older person and partnering them up, and actually having the older person learn things from the younger person. Not because the younger person is smarter or has more experience, because they don't, but because that kind of relationship can have really impactful value. So one of the things we emphasize in our congregation, particularly under my portfolio, is we start leadership at age 11, which might be really surprising for some churches. A lot of people think that kids don't have the maturity to take on responsibility, and that's perfectly understandable. Some of these 11-year-olds are still, picking their nose and running around the sanctuary. But these 11-year-olds are under leadership of 14-year-olds, who are under leadership of 25-year-olds, who are under leadership of a pastor. And in this sort of model, we have young kids who are able to connect with and build relationships with our little 5-year-olds that the pastors may or may not be able to build. And so this has become really crucial to our ministry there. And reverse mentoring is all a part of it. Identifying giftings at a very young age and realizing that what even the 5-year-olds have to offer us, we can actually learn from. It's not just top down, it's bottom up as well. The fourth thing that millennials said was important to them in a church was a church that emphasized vocational discipleship. And what Barna meant by this is specifically a church that emphasized that you don't need to be a pastor in order to be a Christian 24/7. But your call to be an accountant, or to be a lawyer, or to be a secretary, or a dentist is a call. And that vocation of being a Christian in the marketplace is actually important. The fifth thing that was emphasized is these churches facilitated a connection to Jesus. That is a church, right? Like, all churches should be facilitating a connection to Jesus, but unfortunately that's not always the priority in churches. Facilitating a connection point to Jesus was the most important thing to millennials. So not just the head knowledge, not just learning about Jesus, but experiencing that relationship with Jesus. The only unique value proposition we have is Jesus. So now I'm going to talk about a new church. So there are several options for a new church. We've talked about revitalized ministry of an existing congregation. This afternoon we're going to talk about a replant situation. Alex is going to be with us to speak about that. And I've been asked to talk about a new church plant. To reach millennials and Generation Z, I think something radical really needs to happen. Because you can't assume that they're coming in with any religious knowledge. In most of our existing churches, even the liturgy assumes that you have some religious knowledge. So imagine walking into the congregation without any understanding of what the congregation is all about. You don't know about Jesus. You don't know about God. You maybe think that there is some sort of being out there, some divine being, but you don't know much beyond that. And a friend invited you to church, and you walk in and you don't know what is going on. When I was in high school, I was invited to church by a Catholic friend. And let me tell you, they stood up and kneeled and sat down and stood up and kneeled and sat down, and I couldn't keep up with it. It felt like an aerobics class, but I did not know what was going on. And I knew that I stood out like a sore thumb because I was constantly sitting when they were standing, and vice versa. But I think that's what a lot of people feel like when they walk into our churches. Do I stand out like a sore thumb? Maybe they don't even stand out, but they feel that way. So are things written out, either on a screen or in the bulletin, in such a way that is welcoming in the outsider? That's something we need to consider. Even the way we do communion. If we don't explain it from the front, can you imagine walking into a congregation, not knowing who Jesus is, not knowing what the Bible's all about, and being told that you're given a meal of somebody's flesh and blood that has been made holy, and you are supposed to partake in it. And then they pass out little wafers and little cups. Like, can you imagine what that would feel like? That would be so overwhelming and so confusing too. So explaining each step, every step of the way, is crucial if we're going to reach people who are truly unchurched. This is really difficult in most of our congregations, which is why I think planting churches that are specific to this, a very rich heritage of church planting. But what worked in the 1960s, when most of the churches were being planted, is not going to work today, because it's a completely different context. A new generation necessarily means a new congregation, a new type of ministry. And we're reaching people with zero religious background. In the 1960s, you could assume that people understood a little bit about church. Maybe they'd heard about the Trinity, maybe some of them had the Lord's Prayer memorized, maybe they'd gone to Sunday school as kids. You can't assume that anymore. I want to define what a new church is not, and I think this is very critical. A new church is not trying to make worship more comfortable. A new church does not mean trying to get some cool factor up front to make worship more comfortable for people. A new church does not dilute the gospel to appeal to outsiders. We can't dilute the gospel, or we have nothing to offer people. And a new church does not try to appeal to culture by being like culture. Millennials hate this. Millennials like authenticity, and so they don't want to see somebody being phony, trying to be like them, in order to get them in, win them over, and then bait and switch, change things on them. And then suddenly there's all these new rules about living, and they thought the church was just like the culture. So here are 6 characteristics that I didn't create myself. Actually, they're written in the book of Acts, characteristics of a new church. And I want to define these each individually. But each of them is radical. Radical generosity, radical family, radical healing, radical prayer, radical hospitality, and radical sacrifice. If you're taking notes, I'll go back over them. Don't worry. These are characteristics, not really of a new church, but of an old church as well. And I think we need to go back to what the church was in the beginning in order to really think about what the church can be today. Because we don't want to just change method. We need to think about what church is, what's the purpose, and how do we reach people. So I'm going to read from the book of Acts in chapter 2. This is talking about the early apostles. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Could you envision our churches looking like that? The Lord adding to your number daily those who are being saved. That's not the case for our church, by the way. Radical generosity is the first thing I want to talk about. Characteristic of a new church. And again, all 6 of these principles can be applied to an existing congregation, but I think the 6 together are what could become a church plant idea. Radical generosity is insiders are expected to give, and outsiders are expected to benefit. Insiders are expected to give, and outsiders are expected to benefit. So a while ago, there was a notion that a church would host bake sales or clothing sales, things of that nature, where people in the community would come and support the church for their bottom line. My husband and I worked in a church before that was working through this process of really rethinking what it meant to no longer host bake sales and sales where you're asking the community for money to support your bottom line. Instead, you want to be asking your people for money to support the community. So I like to think of this as radical open-handedness. Not a word, but radical open-handedness is this. I was sitting around a table with our personnel committee, and it was at my home, actually, a few years ago, and one of the people on the committee opened up, a member of the congregation for many years, and just shared of serious financial problems that their family had been having. And without batting an eye, the other people around the table got out their wallets, literally emptied them onto the table, and passed the money to this person. It was such a profound moment for me to just crystally see the church in action. Just, oh, you need this more than I do, here. Handing their money over. That's what I mean by radical open-handedness. It's holding people tightly and things loosely. So our church right now has a 10% in, 18% out principle. And that means we recommend, it's not required, that members and those who consider themselves a part of the congregation give 10% tithe. But what we are committed to as a congregation is that 18% of our budget goes out the door. And it actually ends up being considerably more than that when you factor in things like our summer camp. But basically 18% goes out to missions. That goes out to missionaries, to individual organizations, etc. We're in a particular place and demographic where that is more possible than most churches. There's a large contingent of people in the congregation who are upper middle class, have jobs in the city, and live in the suburbs. And so I understand that that is not possible in every context. But that is just evidence of this idea of radical open-handedness. The next thing I want to talk about is radical sacrifice. I think one of the best places I've ever seen radical sacrifice happen was at an orphanage that I worked at. As I mentioned, I lived in Guatemala for a while. And I worked at an orphanage and taught school. And then at night, I would take care of the babies in Casa de los Angelitos, which is like the baby house. There were about 20 babies at any given time that we would be caring for. But one of the older houses actually decided on their spring break, this is a group of about 25 orphans, they decided that they had it pretty good at the orphanage. And so they applied to go on a mission trip to the slums in Guatemala. And they gave up their spring break, left the orphanage, and went and cared for those who were living in La Basura, which is the garbage dump. To me, this is living sacrificially. It's realizing I actually have it a lot better than most. what can I do to serve and to give? It's not just giving your 10% out of an obligation. It's giving of yourself sacrificially. Whether that's your money, your time, your resources, your energy. I think this is a characteristic of a great church. It's filled with people who are ready to give sacrificially. Radical family is the third point I would like to make. As I mentioned, we have a pretty big small group ministry at our church. But what we emphasize is not just teaching in our small groups, but fellowship. And so my husband and I host a small group, and our living area in our home is pretty small. It would fit basically from here to the chairs and just this part of the stage. It would be our downstairs. And in that area, we host weekly 8 adults, 5 children under the age of 4, and a black lab. You can imagine it is messy. It is very messy. And we talk about the Bible, we talk about the sermons. We do have our sermons on podcasts so people can listen to them if they haven't been there that week. But I think what happens more is that we pass kids around from lap to lap. And what was great evidence that this is successful to me, that we actually have taught our daughter what it means to be a radical family, is this. We were in Ottawa a couple weeks ago with my parents, and we were at the National Art Gallery. And my daughter has learned at 13 months of age that any kind person can be your mother or sister or father. And so she saw this kindly couple sitting on a bench looking at a painting, and she thought, oh, more grandparents for me. And she walked up to them and she said, oh! And this nice woman picked her up and looked at me like, what? And then handed her back to me. And this might also be evidence of my bad parenting. But the point to me that I'm trying to make is that for her, family is radical. It's not just doing family as a nuclear unit. It's doing family as a body of believers. And this has taken on many different forms. The black lab that was ours actually lives with one of the other people in our small group now. I got sick 8 months ago, and we decided we couldn't care for him. And so one of the other families in our small group took him on. So he's still part of the small group. But that is radical family. Jesus told his followers that anyone who does the will of his Father is his brother and sister and mother. That's what radical family means. Radical healing is another piece of it. Again, at the orphanage, while I was there was a young girl. She was 14 years old. And she would come to Casa de los Angelitos every morning and drop off her 1-year-old son. If you can just picture that for a moment. I'm sorry, she was 15 at that time. So she had been 14 when she became pregnant. I later found out that her father was the father of her son. It was one of the most grievous situations I had ever heard, and shockingly all too common in Central and South America. One of the things the orphanage does once a month is they would host parents who were still alive. Many of the orphans actually had living parents who they'd been removed from. The government required this, and so the orphanage said, fine, the parents can come, but they have to go to church, and they have to take a parenting seminar from us. One morning I walked into the church, and this kind of scroungy looking man was sitting next to this young lady who I came to know so well. And he stood up and he handed me an orange. He said, thank you for taking care of my daughter. I was really taken aback, and I never ate the orange. I sat it on my bookshelf because I was disgusted and also in awe. she was actually proud to introduce her father to me. She had no desire to go back home, but that made me question something, and that story actually is what led into me going into ministry. And I started asking myself, what had happened in that situation that had allowed that little girl to have any semblance of healing or reconciliation with her father? And it was this: Jesus. She had met Jesus, and I actually believe her dad had met Jesus through the local church in that place. It was a sick and complicated situation, but psychology can only provide so much. Medical attention can only provide so much. You know, the orphanage can provide food and water and clothing for the kids, but that only gives so much. I think the only thing that can provide the kind of radical healing and transformation that needed to take place in that situation was Christ himself. That is radical healing. The last two are radical prayer and radical hospitality. Radical prayer is not just incorporating prayers into the sermon. Radical prayer is being dedicated to living your lives as lives of prayer. This can take place in many different ways, and as we're short on time, I don't want to get into all of the specific ways that that can take place. At our congregation, we do dedicate the first hour of the week and the first hour Sunday morning. So everyone's required to be there at 7 a.m. Sunday morning for an hour of prayer before we get into anything else, before the worship team practices or anything. And then we begin staff on Tuesday morning with an hour of prayer as well. And that just helps us to set our hearts right before God before we get into the nitty-gritty. Radical hospitality, the final one. I've seen this at work in many different ways. I actually know a family who's involved with the congregation, and at their congregation there was a teenager and a mom who had just been evicted from their home. So they were going to be homeless. So this family said, okay, come live with us. And I kid you not, it was that simple of a conversation, because I knew these people well, and they opened their home to this homeless family, and they went and lived with them. And about 6 months down the road, they helped work with the mom to get her a job, and now the mom is paying rent to them as well, a smaller amount of rent. But to see the family of believers operate in this way was incredible. It's messy. The whole situation is messy. The church can be very messy. But that was radical hospitality in a way I have rarely seen elsewhere. In a slightly easier method, I've seen this. I've seen elderly people welcome college students into their homes for a period of time. This can be a way to show radical hospitality in your community. I have been the beneficiary of this. While I was a seminary student, I had the beautiful experience of being able to live with a 90-year-old woman for a summer while I was doing one of my placements. And let me tell you, that relationship was something that could not be matched. I'm not close to my grandparents personally, and so she became for me like a grandparent, and I became for her like a granddaughter. All of her grandkids lived very far away, so it was just a beautiful time of life for both of us to be able to connect in that way as believers. That is radical hospitality. Another way you can live out radical hospitality in your congregation is this. Each summer, we have about 400 kids and youth who participate in our summer camp. And we fully fund the program through the congregation, so we invite community members in. So just imagine this for a second. 400, mostly unchurched. We get about 75 of our own kids. The rest of that would be unchurched people from the community. They're muddy, like they get dirty at summer camp, and they run through our sanctuary, through the church, for a week long, and we have a blast. We're doing a Narnia-themed curriculum this year, which I am ecstatic about. But it's going to be messy. And that is just part and parcel of our church. We actually schedule every year professional cleaners to come in the week after our summer camp to detail everything, including like the chairs in pews, because everything just gets dirty. And we expect that. But that's part of what it means to be radically hospitable. Not saying like, oh, don't bring your coffee in the sanctuary, your cookies have to stay in the foyer. It's saying, come on in, welcome here, we'll live with you in the mess of it all. So that is just, those 6 things are the things that I think are just so crucial to any congregation, yes, but if there is going to be some sort of new movement or church planting opportunity, whether in Oak Ridges or in some other presbytery, to reach millennials and Generation Z, I think it's so important to have those 6 things in place. They all fit within the notion of church as a movement with a mission. They all fit within the gospel, but they also don't assume any previous church experience, which I think is crucial to reaching those generations. Maybe you connect with the idea of a church plant. Maybe you'll go home and use one or some of these in your own church. I just want to leave you with this. The only unique value proposition we have is Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. That was wonderful to hear the teachings from Scripture, and I really like the emphasis on Jesus, that He is our focus. That's the thing which we bring. I was thinking about this, that it was as millennials come in and 2 or 3 generations have had no Christian memory. If any of you are NFL football fans, you know Chicago had a great team years ago, and Mike Duca was the coach. There are guys like Peyton Manning, but there was a guy called the Refrigerator Perry. I mean, the guy was built like a refrigerator. And before the football game, the coach said to the chaplain, we got to have a prayer, and I want the refrigerator to lead us in the Lord's Prayer. One of the guys said to the chaplain, I'll bet you $50 he doesn't know it. The chaplain thought, okay, you're on. So the refrigerator starts the prayer. This is the Lord's Prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. Finish the prayer. The football player said, I didn't think he knew it. So that kind of gives you an idea of where people are at. Let me encourage you about this idea of reverse mentoring. That is so important. In this season of life where I am, I have 2 people who are a lot younger who I invite to speak into my life. Tell me, what is your generation thinking and saying? I need to know that. It's not just me telling you my thing and my story. And they're quite happy to speak into my life. And so I think a lot of us in our churches need to be open to these younger voices to see where they are coming from and making that a very welcome experience. So our time, we're going to break for lunch. But I want to give you a little, if you're wondering what am I going to talk about at lunch, let me give you a couple of ideas which we can pick up from here. Connie mentioned 6 characteristics: generosity, family life, hospitality, prayer, sacrifice, and being a healing place. You might want to around your table talk about, well, here is one area that is a characteristic of our church. And just hear the stories from each other. That can be very helpful in seeing where we're going to go from there.